Storm clouds gathered above a barren expanse as a single bolt of lightning tore downward. It struck the ground with impossible force and carved a bright fissure through rock. Energy spiraled outward in rings that shattered the soil and scattered debris. At the epicenter, a lone figure stood unmoved beneath the rain and lightning. A panel named him plainly as Fist King, and the letters burned on black. Close-up revealed a broad shoulder and the weathered skin of a practiced hand. A caption explained the title, and it told how he had subjugated the Jianghu. He had conquered factions with bare fists alone and left no open challengers. The storm closed around him as the scene held in silence. Witnesses nearby would remember the strike as proof of his singular and brutal dominance. The panels named him plainly as Fist King and then revealed Dan Wusung. Lightning backlit his broad frame as he remained amid ruined ground and rain. A close-up lingered on his jaw and a single narrowed eye as he fought to breathe. He made a choked sound when pain flared. Bloodied hands and fallen attackers cluttered the clearing around him. He admitted he had been ambushed by a mysterious group and scanned the scene for threats. He trailed off mid-thought and let the rain fill the pause. He moved to the rim of a rocky ledge and looked down toward a narrow path. The panels held on his silhouette as tension gathered and left the moment unresolved. Fist King stood on the cliff and declared that only 2 remained among the attackers. A scarred man below acknowledged their skill and questioned their origin. A cloaked masked fighter moved with sudden speed and launched a precise strike. The encounter turned into a short, brutal exchange of blades and energy slashes. The strike tore through defense and sent dark fluid across the stone. One attacker tumbled over the cliff and disappeared into the rain. The remaining assailant staggered backward and pressed against the rock, chest soaking with blood. Dan Wusung watched the fallout with a steady, unreadable face and made a terse remark about returning a captive. The scene closed on the wounded body and the cliffside silence that followed. Rain hammered the cliff as 2 figures faced each other under low light. Dan Wusung noted the assailant had sliced through an arm and fought dirty. He read the symbol on the opponent's blade and asked about their faction. The question hung between them across the cold, wet air and settled. Fist King received the remark with a tight jaw and steady focus. Dan praised Fist King's endurance and noted how long he had held. Fist King cut the praise short with a curt command to shut it. Blades struck stone, and a boot hit puddled water with sharp splashes. A wounded body lay near the cliff edge, half swallowed by shadow. Their words faded into taut silence while rain washed the ruined scene. Both men prepared for the next movement without another outward sign. Rain still hammered the cliff as Dan Wusung faced the blue-haired challenger. Dan had already noted the sliced arm and the strange symbol on the challenger's blade. The challenger spat a vow to kill in 10 attacks. Dan answered with a cool dismissal and called the threat arrogant. Boots slipped on wet stone and the air tightened around them. The challenger surged and sent violet energy streaking forward in rapid blows. Dan shrugged off the rhythm and unleashed a blunt countercharge that met the assault. Sparks and arcs scattered, forcing the challenger back beneath the shock. Silence fell with one man forced to steady himself, while the other remained firmly on his feet. Rain washed the ruined exchange as both prepared for the next movement. Rain beat the cliff while Dan Wusung and the blue-haired challenger resumed their clash. The challenger lunged in a faster tempo, with violet energy tearing the air. Dan measured the rhythm and absorbed blow after blow while keeping his footing. He cataloged each strike aloud and counted through the assault with calm precision. Sparks erupted at contact and light scattered across their forms. The challenger faltered between bursts and muttered that something restrained his motion. Dan stayed steady and used his count to time responses, converting rhythm into control. Each numbered beat pulled the attacker off tempo and opened brief windows for counters. By the final number, both men braced for the next decisive move. Rain washed the torn gap, while tension climbed toward the next strike. Rain had pelted the cliff, while the blue-haired challenger rose above Dan Wusung. Violet energy forked from the challenger and tore the air toward the fighter below. Dan measured tempo, absorbed strike after strike, and kept his footing with steady breath. The challenger faltered between bursts and muttered that something restrained his motion. A close view showed the challenger smile, while Dan's face tightened with focus. The challenger drew a blade in a low motion and aimed a killing cut. Dan counted through the rhythm and timed a precise counter to the blade. The blade carved flesh and blood stained Dan's mouth, but he did not fall. The challenger gasped as his tempo broke, and he staggered on his own effort. He then whispered a final boast that he had ended the Fist King's reign. The blue-haired challenger lunged with violet strikes and a low blade that sliced into Dan Wusung. Dan timed a precise counter, yet tasted blood and stayed upright despite the wound. The challenger faltered, gasped, and whispered a final boast that he had ended the Fist King's reign. Dan coughed and steadied his breath, then watched the challenger crumble from his own broken tempo. Rain washed the torn earth and scattered sparks across the pit. From the rocks a voice spoke with quiet respect and called him the Fist King. Dan remained on his feet, wounded but unbowed, while the battlefield lay scarred and silent beneath the storm. The blue-haired challenger pressed his advantage with a low blade and sharp taunts while Rain pounded the pit. Dan Wusung timed a counter and stayed upright despite the wound, but blood and fatigue edged his vision. The challenger crumbled from his own broken tempo, then hurled another insult and drove a downward blow. Dan felt his strength leaving his body and feared this might be his final hour as the Fist King. He managed only a strained breath and a fading wish as darkness pressed in. The storm swallowed most sounds, but one abrupt syllable, 10, cut through the rain and hung in the air like a last signal. The wounded fighter tasted blood and mourned a single missed opportunity. He thought he could have landed one more blow. The narration then named the Fist King Dan Wusung as dead and placed the blame with the demon faction. Blue energy ripped through the battlefield and shattered the night, and a raven swept across the stormy light. The perspective cut away from the pit and traveled to Junha Mountain Safe House. Inside, residents received the report and reacted with quiet shock. One voice whispered a sharp exclamation, while another answered in confusion. The announcement settled over the room like a verdict, and the occupants paused to measure the loss and its new consequences. At the Junha Mountain Safe House, a woman leaned close and called out to the sleeping man. He stirred and muttered as he searched the room and the fragments of memory. His body felt whole. He checked himself and found no fresh wounds. The caretaker and others hovered nearby and explained he had been woken and sheltered. When they called him the first young master, he froze and stared at his reflection in a nearby mirror. The title did not match his certainty. The occupants exchanged glances while the man tried to reconcile the name with his identity. The moment tightened into a private panic as the room waited for his answer. At the Junha Mountain Safe House, the first young master woke and reached instinctively for his face. He felt an unfamiliar film against his skin and demanded who had put a mask over him. The caretaker and others moved closer and answered in careful tones. He examined the surface and insisted that this was not a mask. His fingers traced the area and found a raised mark that tightened his confusion into focus. He pushed himself upright and steadied his breath while the occupants exchanged guarded glances. A sudden crash struck the door and the room snapped to alert. An attendant peered in and reported that he was fully awake today. The first young master met their eyes with a steady expression and waited for their next words. After waking, the first young master examined a small framed portrait on the table. He frowned at the unfamiliar face and mouthed the question who this person might be. He traced the frame and admitted he would have to find out. He moved to the window and scanned the courtyard and alleys beyond for any clue. Returning, he walked the room methodically, testing his balance and the stiffness in his limbs. He sat at the table and studied the portrait, noting details he could not match. A childish image of a small deer flickered in his mind, and he scolded himself for feeling fragile. He called his reaction absolute garbage and squared his shoulders, preparing to learn the stranger's identity. After preparing to learn the stranger's identity, the first young master returned to the table. He smoothed a paper and read the bold header Yunha Merchant Group. He traced the stamped receiver line, reading each printed name slowly and carefully. Gold coins and a merchant hall image filled the page, suggesting wealth and influence. A separate note named the owner of the body as the eldest son Lee Jinian. He lifted other letters and scanned their lines for context and signatures. Most notes spoke of money payments, dowries, and favors tied to the family. A nearby caretaker watched silently as he absorbed the businesslike details. He felt a sharp contempt for the trivial concerns so plainly recorded. He muttered that the man was little more than a loser and shook his head. He catalogued names and facts he could use and resolved to trace the merchant. After cataloging the merchant correspondence, the first young master returned to the table and read further. He traced stamped names, found Lee Jinian, and dismissed the family's petty commerce. A hand peeled back cloth from a nearby face, and someone said it was neither sorcery nor a mask. Bystanders leaned forward as recognition edged into disbelief, and one watcher wondered aloud if it was reincarnation. The first young master laughed shortly, then rose from his chair. Servants shouted his title and rushed toward him, alarm in their voices. A caretaker hurried closer and asked if he was all right. In the sudden noise, two shadowed men moved behind the table, and a rough voice demanded who the hell this was. After the earlier commotion, servants surged forward and called out the young man's name. The first young master brushed off their alarm and said he had been worried but was fine. A caretaker moved closer and asked his condition while attendants prepared a simple meal. Someone announced that chicken soup was ready, and a servant carried a steaming bowl forward. He accepted the bowl and sipped slowly as bystanders exchanged uneasy glances around the table. A long-haired man watched him intently and tightened his jaw with visible calculation. His inner thought labeled the young man a rotten bastard and compared him to a snake. Servants paused in the sudden hush, and the room's suspicion lingered beneath polite motions. After the earlier commotion, servants returned with a steaming bowl and chatter about the Dragon Phoenix competition. The first young master accepted the bowl briefly and listened as a man guessed the competition's number. He replied that he was not sure and estimated about 200. When he declined the meal, he told them to leave the soup nearby. A caretaker protested, but he insisted she should not wake him. He then stood and pushed open the sliding screen with a sharp motion. Inside the dim room, he checked the time and considered the competition's proximity. It meant his death had not been long ago, and the fact calmed him. He tied back his hair and allowed a small relieved murmur to pass. He whispered that it was good. After the earlier commotion, the first young master refused the steaming bowl and pushed the screen aside. He checked the time and concluded the Dragon Phoenix competition was drawing dangerously near. He tied back his hair and allowed a short, relieved murmur to escape. Outside the corridor, men whispered that the demonic faction should still be alive. Someone added that a snake-like physician was among their number. A grinning man in a cap boasted he was surrounded by people needing a beating. Dan Wusung stood from the shadows and listened with a slow smile. He rolled his fingers deliberately and flexed his knuckles as a man making a promise. He told them not to worry and called them rotten bastards. He promised he would kill them all with a single punch this time. The threat cut the air and froze the room into a brittle silence. No one answered, and the corridor waited for the first movement. After the corridor's brittle silence, Dan Wusung entered the dining chamber and took his place. A spread of Western dishes sat on the table and drew a small chorus of surprised remarks. The attendants mentioned his new tastes and traded light jokes about his past meals. Dan ate without ceremony and tasted the unfamiliar sauces with slow focus. He flexed his fingers and spoke in the same flat voice he had used before. Staff attended the room quietly while one reminded them to keep the breakfast as ordered. Dan wrapped a towel at his waist and prepared to rise. A man stepped forward and offered a formal greeting while naming himself Gongsun Mings. The room shifted attention to the new arrival. A young attendant watched with cautious amusement. The staff maintained their distance as Dan finished eating in steady, deliberate motion. An attendant hesitated at the doorway and whispered to Dan Wusung, "Sir." The visitor entered and bowed low, announcing himself as Gongsun Mings to the room. Staff exchanged murmured remarks about his blunt manners, and one called him rude. Gongsun Mings stepped forward and shouted for the master with excessive fervor. The shout broke the breakfast stillness and forced all eyes toward the doorway. Dan Wusung watched without surprise and let the noise wash over him. He considered responding directly and briefly thought about testing the visitor's composure. Dan's inward question asked whether he should try catching this little rat. The man's loud manner left the servants embarrassed and alert around the table. Dan resumed his meal and calmly asked for clarification about the visitor's profession. The attendant bowed and offered a bowl with deliberate casualness toward Dan Wusung. Servants exchanged uneasy glances while the newcomer watched with a thin smile. Dan lifted the cup and pretended to savor the aroma without haste. Dan weighed whether testing the visitor's composure would be worth provoking trouble. He let the room's tension settle around the small ritual of tasting. The server's face tightened. He whispered a warning about poison under his breath. Gongsun Mings answered with a casual flourish and claimed medicinal intent for the master. He called the broth dragon phoenix soup and framed it as restorative for the master. A servant recoiled and accused him of using poison to seduce their master. The room snapped toward the old man's shout, then fell silent in embarrassment. Dan smiled without answering and allowed the accusation to hang in the air unread. Gongsun then stepped forward and announced himself as their personal physician to the household. His voice forced a new kind of attention and tested everyone's composure. Gongsun Mings feigned retreat and said he would leave if unwelcome. A servant addressed him nervously as Physician Gongsun and stammered assent. Gongsun leveled a cool question at Dan Wusung about authority and arriving without summons. He accused the man of acting like the master rather than a physician. The room stiffened and the servant shrank under the implied rebuke. Then Gongsun smirked and laughed off the confrontation as a jest. He requested writing tools and ordered a letter prepared without delay. Dan Wusung suppressed surprise while a servant moved to obey the command. Gongsun stated he would dictate and directed the attendant to write each word. The attendant complied and the room returned to controlled, uneasy attention. Gongsun Mings had just finished dictating when an attendant spoke of Li Jinian's illness. The attendant said he must remain to tend the first young master for some time. The room held its breath as that pledge settled into uneasy silence. A sudden motion cut through the hush and a shadow leapt forward. An attack struck the attendant across the throat and left him wounded. Blood darkened his collar, and his body sagged slowly against the table. A figure stepped into the light and threw the room off balance. He declared that he was not the Lei Jinian of the past anymore. Gongsun Mings and the other attendants flinched while the wounded man begged for explanation. The formal calm snapped, and the chamber swiftly dissolved into open fear. The attendants resumed their argument over the remedy and whether it was tonic or poison. One man insisted the medicine helped healthy people but would be fatal to someone already so sick. A physician in the room was accused of secretly checking the patient's pulse. He protested shock and denied murderous intent. The patient rose and confronted them, saying he had noticed the covert check and that their actions amounted to attempted murder. He declared those involved were not acting alone. The chamber tensed as suspicion spread. Gongsun Mings watched quietly while the wounded attendant bled and waited. Talk turned to action, and a messenger was to be sent to the old lord's manor. Faces hardened under that new directive. The argument over the remedy had left the chamber taut and watchful. The patient accused colleagues of secretly checking his pulse and called it attempted murder. Voices hardened as suspicion spread, and a messenger was ordered to the old lord's manor. Gongsun Mings remained silent while the wounded attendant bled on the floor. A senior man mocked the accused and asked how someone could suspect a kind man. He sneered that even a scoundrel could show conscience. He said the accused had finally shown his true colors. The accused said he had tried to let the patient pass with dignity and called them foolish. The mocker smiled and promised the accused would carry a painful burden. A sudden motion cut through the chatter. A hand flashed across the room and struck a face. Blood sprayed from the wound. Shock froze the room, and every eye turned toward the violence. The room stayed tense after the earlier argument and the wounded attendant on the floor. Dan Wusung refused distractions and ate while he spoke with deliberate calm. He explained that the patient required the stomach to be excised quickly to survive. He insisted this was the only way and that he would bear the burden afterward. Caretaker and onlookers listened without interrupting as the plan unfolded. He measured time and necessity with a cold certainty in his voice. Mid-sentence he paused, hand coming to his forehead from a sharp ache. The sudden headache stunned the small group and loosened the heavy air in the chamber. A nearby servant rushed forward and shouted, "Sir," drawing every eye toward Dan Wusung in alarm. A shouted name split the quiet chamber and drew all eyes to the attendant. Denial passed through the room in a single whispered no. Then fragmented memories unfurled before the watchers like falling images. The group realized the visions belonged to Lei Jinian. The images showed ledger tables, family portraits, and a young man who carried a weaker fate. Narration identified him as the first son of the wealthy Yunhe merchant group. It noted he was neither as clever as his second brother nor as strong as his third. Those facts marked him as a lacking eldest son. The revelation changed the room's mood and refocused the attendants on the man's hidden past. The room had learned the eldest son's quiet failings and watched the attendants' denial pass. Then focus shifted away from the ledger to a lone man in a distant villa. He had tried to compensate for shortcomings with wine and business travel. By the time he admitted mistakes and turned back, it had been too late. Neglected health worsened, while others arranged care and moved him to the villa. Attendants noted small improvements, then warned recovery might still fail, perhaps altogether. The man believed a few days of rest would restore his strength. He paced the veranda and reviewed each lapse in distant silence and regret. Then he noticed his finger and froze, as if a small sign altered everything. Li Jinian had paced the villa veranda and found no answers to ease him. A small wound on his finger stopped him and forced a quiet reassessment. Inside the room, vials and labeled bottles waited on a low wooden table. He stared at the elixirs and told himself he could afford any remedy. Without fanfare, he left the estate and walked toward cliffs that promised quiet recovery. The mountains and blossoms became his slow regimen of rest and careful treatments. Days melted into seasons, while sunlight, rain, and small remedies reshaped his body. Panels showed wide cliffs, blooming trees, and quiet paths that marked passing months. A caption read 1 year later, and he returned to the compound with measured steps. He entered the hall, and a woman stepped forward to call his name uncertainly. Her greeting was tentative yet hopeful, and it pierced the quiet he had kept. He steadied himself for news that might console or chastise, and then listened. Li Jinian had returned to the compound after a year of quiet recovery. He entered the hall and listened as a messenger announced himself with a letter. A merchant guard captain stepped forward and asked where he might find the young master. An attendant woman pointed toward the inner room and indicated where Lai rested. The messenger moved closer, but then froze when he glimpsed the figure inside. A close view caught his widened eye and the tremor in his voice. He managed a fractured name and tried to process what he had seen. The final panel revealed Lai Jinian bathing bare and strong under soft daylight. Months of treatment had rebuilt his body and left him visibly transformed. The messenger's shock carried both recognition and the quiet confirmation of recovery. After returning to the compound, Li Jinian continued his recovery in isolation. Seasons passed and his energy core finally manifested beneath his ribs. He built martial arts principles around that core and disciplined his body daily. He engraved martial arts required for survival into his practice. He mastered the enlightened mobility art, then expanded into the enlightened body art. He developed the rapid stride and refined the white ultimate triple pulse art. Training accelerated his form and condensed power into layered phases of control. By constant practice, he reached the 4th phase and stabilized his core. Everything had proceeded smoothly for months, and his progress seemed complete. Then an unnoticed strain registered within his chest, and doubts crept in. A single silent sign suggested a fault that hours of training could not erase. Li Jinian had trained until his core stabilized, yet a quiet strain remained under his ribs. Months of isolated practice had distilled techniques around his inner energy core. He had mastered several enlightened arts and achieved the 4th phase of control. Everything had progressed smoothly until a subtle fault registered inside his chest. On the courtyard floor, he collapsed after a testing strike and rolled onto the wood. He touched his chest and muttered that the result was not enough for him. A servant's voice called him young Master Jinian from the doorway with careful concern. His eyes narrowed as he weighed weakness against the long road of recovery. Gongsun Mings entered with a restrained smile and presented a folded letter. He announced he had brought a message from the main clan to convey. Li Jinian accepted the paper and replied with a quiet, measured okay. Outside, fallen leaves drifted across the courtyard as the moment tightened around him. Li Jinian had just accepted a message and then asked to see his wound. He examined a faint trail across his skin and searched where it led. The pain in his arm flared, and he muttered that the limb felt like it might fail. Gongsun Mings watched with restrained concern and answered him softly. They moved to the courtyard table and read the clan note about the first young master. The report recorded collapse and bedridden status, but provided no explanation for the illness. Li Jinian turned the paper over and frowned at the missing cause. He pressed his temple with one hand and measured the gap between his training gains and this stubborn internal strain. Outside leaves drifted across the courtyard as he weighed recovery against family duty. After reading the clan note, Lee Jinian listened as rumors spread through the courtyard tables. Voices suggested the collapse was most likely because of the dying clan's interference. Several men dismissed witness reports as small fry with low credibility and motive. Speakers implied bribery and pressure, had silenced testimony, and twisted public truth. An official voice cleared a throat and read a dispatch about unrest at the estate. The dispatch named no cause and framed the affair as chaotic but unresolved. Bystanders concluded that authorities and rival factions had done nothing to intervene. Lee Jinian pressed his temple and weighed the unanswered questions against his family duty. Gongsun Ming stayed near and answered him softly while watching faces for leaks. Lee Jinian had just heard the dispatch when a shadowed man spoke in the hall. The speaker's face was half hidden, and his voice threaded threat through the room. Lee listened, smiled, and answered calmly before the others could unpack the accusation. Two attendants argued about the cause and whether a famed fighter had collapsed. A sudden strike was shown in a flash panel, and a man was driven to the floor. Witnesses wondered aloud if the collapse was shock, injury, or a hidden attack. Lee and Gongsun Ming sat close and observed every face for truth or deceit. He refused to accept a simple explanation and resolved not to sit idle any longer. Tension in the hall tightened after the dispatch and accusations. A trembling messenger stepped forward and offered a returned letter with an apology. Dan Wusung rose with deliberate, controlled motion and announced he would go himself to face the issue. The proclamation read like a public declaration and shifted every eye toward him. Servants reacted with stunned praise and called him changed and a perfect martial artist. Some reached out in wonder while others exchanged cautious, suspicious glances. Lee Jinian and Gongsun Ming's continued to watch faces for truth and hidden intent. Dan Wusung gathered himself and prepared to depart, forcing fresh questions about motives and new loyalties in the room. Tension had tightened in the hall after the proclamation and the returned apology letter. A cluster of nobles broke into scornful laughter and pointed openly at the accused. Their taunts hung heavy, while observers checked expressions for loyalty or deceit. A smirking man stepped forward and baited the room with a cruel joke. His grin sharpened the ridicule, and the crowd moved from words toward action. He shoved a man near the front, knocking him back into an empty chair. A few in the room gasped, and some murmured at the rising violence. A caption then identified the smirking man as Han Yop, his grin widening. Familiar faces such as Lee Jinian and Gongsun Ming's watched closely and stayed guarded. Dan Wusung's pending departure lingered over the incident and deepened the room's unease. The hall remained taut after the earlier provocation and public taunts by nobles. A herald then announced Lee Jinian's arrival, and many heads turned toward the entrance. Nobles straightened and muttered about protocol, while others shifted papers and prepared to collect documents. Hostile observers fixed their gazes, and some feigned indifference. Outside, Lee Jinian approached the compound and paused briefly on the threshold before entering. He moved without show and scanned the chamber with a steady face. He thought the situation was insane, and his expression held a quiet resignation. Han Yop kept his smirk and let the unrest feed his presence. Gongsun Ming's and familiar attendants stayed guarded and adjusted their stances. Dan Wusung's impending departure remained an unresolved element in the room's watchful atmosphere. The hall held its charge as attendants finished errands and spoke in low tones. Two women bent toward a seated figure and offered care before a man rose and left toward the compound edge. Dan Wusung walked the balcony alone and scanned the courtyard with a steady gaze. His face remained composed while footsteps and a single reaching hand shifted the room's balance. A guard's motion drew weapons, and a brief flare of steel answered the movement. Below, an official voice called the gathering and benches filled beneath the beams. Someone mounted the dais and addressed the assembly while nobles fixed their expressions. Han Yop kept his smirk and let the unrest feed his presence. Conversations tested loyalties and offers of protection passed among the rows. Dan Wusung's impending departure remained unanswered as the hall watched for the next move. Dan Wusung stepped out before the benches and offered a calm, formal greeting to the assembly. He clasped his hands together and gave a short bow that sought to steady the room. A ripple of applause rose and then stalled as the audience judged the gesture. Faces brightened briefly, then soured at what many called modesty rather than spectacle. Small clusters of attendees voiced audible disappointment and then muttered about expectations left unmet. A few onlookers leaned in and noted how his manner had changed since before. Dan kept his composure as whispers flowed and nobles exchanged looks across the hall. He thanked everyone once more in a low voice that carried to the front rows. Nearby companions shared surprised, uncertain smiles and admitted quietly that he felt different now. The moment closed into an awkward hush while the hall waited on the next move. A bearded noble smiled and remarked that the man felt more like an ally than an enemy. Dan Wusung kept his back turned as he and a companion left the assembly. Light fell across their footsteps and stretched their reflections along the floor. Inside the hall, others resumed small talk, and a lattice window framed a quiet corridor. Two attendants traded a brief private exchange about an upcoming fight and thanked each other. A voice murmured well as a reclining pair drew idle attention from nearby nobles. A sharp, observant man then asked others to look and held up an object for display. Whispers spread as guests leaned forward to study the item and sense growing tension. Dan Wusung kept walking without looking back and ignored the gathered murmurs. Guests tightened their circle around Li Jinian, and a smirking noble taunted him openly. The smirking man mocked Jinian as others let the insult hang in the air. An attendant grabbed Jinian's sleeve and urged restraint while another leaned forward to stare. A hand struck toward Jinian and a scuffle erupted as nobles pushed and shoved. Whispers swelled into heated murmurs and the room's mood shifted toward confrontation. Several onlookers laughed, a few stepped back uncertain and measured the risk. Dan Wusung watched from the edge with a cool, unreadable expression. A close inspection of faces recorded small betrayals and quiet alliances forming slowly. Silence fell briefly as the turmoil found an uneasy pause while tension remained. Guests tightened their circle and words turned sharp around Li Jinian. The smirking noble pushed insults and an attendant tried to hold matters steady. Someone called Yaoyan and the room braced. Li Jinian stepped forward and landed a fierce strike to the man's face. The sound of impact cut through the chatter and the smirking man collapsed, bleeding. Onlookers froze between laughter and alarm while a few closed ranks. Dan Wusung remained at the edge with an unreadable look. Faces recorded small betrayals and careful alliances even as chaos flared. The fallen man forced a crooked smile and admitted he had been excited on his way here. Silence followed, heavy with the decision each guest now faced. Guests tightened their circle, and the room hummed with tense, low whispers. Han Yop had sneered and stirred the crowd with a sharp insult. Li Jinian stepped forward and answered with a hard strike to the face. The impact silenced chatter, and the smirking man crumpled to the floor. A figure in white seized the fallen man by the collar and lifted him. Someone at the edge shouted a curse and demanded to know details. The seized man spat a mocking retort and smiled openly without shame. He demanded they call him Big Brother instead of insane bastard now. The words landed as a reveal and immediately tightened every guest's expression. Dan Wusung remained at the edge with his face unreadable and watchful. Decisions rippled through the room as alliances and betrayals sorted themselves quietly. The guests shifted closer, and several voices hushed as they moved down the hall. Someone pointed out the closed door and named it the father's room. Lee Jinian stepped forward and challenged the bystanders, demanding who would stop the unfolding actions. A man at the edge answered and tried to calm the crowd. Two shadowed figures then advanced through the corridor and drew every eye. Lee Jinian lashed out verbally at those who did nothing and ordered them to intervene. Words snapped into action. A sudden scuffle erupted, a body fell and blood stained the floor. The crowd recoiled, then jammed directly in front of the father's door. Dan Wusung watched from the fringe, expression unreadable, as the room braced for what came next. After the scuffle and the crowd's recoil, the hall settled into a cautious hush. The guests drifted into an inner chamber and gathered around a low round table. A man gripped a startled woman and asked if she was Hwa. Attention shifted, and the returning figure took a place at the table. A bespectacled attendant rose and announced he had heard of the return, remarking on the person's apparent good health. The returnee offered a guarded confirmation and a faint smile. Conversation grew quieter when a bandaged hand was revealed and unwrapped. The wound was exposed and drew a closer inspection. The attendant's voice turned to a pointed question about who had inflicted the injury. Dan Wusung remained at the table's edge, expression unreadable, as the group held its breath for an answer and old tensions settled back over the room. The hall had settled into a cautious hush as guests gathered around the low table. A man gripped a startled woman and asked if she was Hwa. Hwa took a measured place at the table and offered a faint smile. A bespectacled attendant rose and noted the return and the visitor's apparent health. When the bandage was unwrapped, a raw wound was revealed and the room leaned closer. Voices sharpened as someone asked who had caused the injury. The injured person was struck again in flash panels and clutched their face while others warned against escalation. The injured then accused Lee Jinian of beating them. The crowd reacted with derision, recalling his former weakness. An attendant confirmed a yard scuffle and said servants had summoned Lee Jinian back to the house.